He was a powerful millionaire, accustomed to controlling everything with the force of his money. His life was made of business, luxury, and authority. But one day, something unexpected shook his empire. He saw his own son sitting in a public square, talking to a simple beggar. To many, it would have been just an ordinary scene. But for him, it was the beginning of a discovery that would change his life forever. The man in the suit and the man in rags seemed to belong to different worlds, but there was something about their unlikely friendship that hid deep secrets. Secrets that should have never been revealed. The millionaire tried to stop it, tried to use his influence and even his money to keep the past buried. But in the end, it was precisely this improbable encounter that brought the truth to light. What this beggar carried was not just misery. It was a direct link to the family's past, a story of pain, cruel choices, and regrets. A truth capable of destroying reputations, but also of setting hearts free. And when everything came to light, tears were shed, alliances were tested, and nothing ever remained the same. This is the story of how a simple conversation can tear down walls built by pride, and of how love, when it is true, recognizes no titles, fortunes, or rags, only the courage to face the truth. Before we continue with this moving story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Oh, and comment down below where you're watching from. We love to know. The millionaire Henrique was accustomed to a meticulously planned routine, business deals, meetings, and social engagements. His life revolved around luxury and discipline, with no room for surprises. Until, on a sunny afternoon, while passing a bustling square, something caught his attention. His son, Raphael, was sitting on the curb talking with a man in rags. Henrique, from the comfort of his luxury car, observed the scene in disbelief. To Henrique, this was unacceptable. The contrast between the image of his impeccably dressed son and the ragged beggar was stark. The millionaire felt a discomfort grow in his chest, as if something in that scene were a direct affront to the world he had built. He couldn't understand how the boy could approach someone so distant from his own reality. Henrique tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was just youthful curiosity, a passing impulse. But the more he looked, the more he realized that Raphael wasn't just being polite. He was involved, attentive, as if that beggar had something important to say. Gradually, a sense of unease settled in. The millionaire, accustomed to having quick answers for everything, now couldn't comprehend the situation. His fingers drummed on the steering wheel, revealing his impatience. A mixture of jealousy and fear washed over him. Fear of losing control over his son. When Raphael stood up to say goodbye, Henrique noticed something that unsettled him even more. The boy smiled, and that smile seemed genuine, light, different from the ones he usually had at home. It was as if the beggar had awakened something in him that not even his own father had managed to. Henrique suppressed his anger and decided not to act at that moment. He preferred to wait, to observe from a distance and try to understand what was really happening. After all, he didn't want to seem overly authoritarian, even if his impulse was simply to forbid that contact. On the way back, the scene replayed in his mind like an unfinished film. The millionaire couldn't forget the beggar's serene gaze, as if he carried a deep secret. Something about him conveyed more than misery. It conveyed a history. Once home, Henrique tried to hide his discomfort, but his wife noticed his restlessness. He avoided commenting on it, saying only that he was tired from work. However, inside him, the feeling grew that this encounter was just the beginning of something much bigger. And so, without realizing it, the millionaire had taken the first step toward a truth that would forever change his life, his family, and the very concept of who he truly was. In the following days, Henrique tried to forget the scene, but his curiosity got the better of him. One afternoon, he decided to pass by the square again. To his surprise, there was Raphael, once again sitting beside the same beggar. The boy was laughing loudly, as if he were among friends. Enrique watched from inside the car, hidden behind the dark glass. With each gesture of camaraderie, his frustration grew. He couldn't understand how a young heir could waste time with someone who had nothing to offer. "What does he see in that man?" he muttered to himself. The beggar, despite his worn appearance, spoke with intensity. His eyes shone, and his expression was that of someone who knew the weight of life. Raphael listened attentively, nodding his head and asking questions. It was a genuine exchange, something rare even in their family conversations at home. Enrique felt betrayed. He, who had dedicated his life to building an empire to secure his son's future, now saw Raphael find more value in a stranger from the streets. The feeling of losing his place in the boy's life ate at him from the inside. Determined to act, the millionaire discreetly called his driver and asked him to investigate the man. He needed information, any detail that would explain what was so special about that miserable figure. The lack of answers was unacceptable to him. Meanwhile, Raphael returned home beaming. During dinner he spoke little, but seemed thoughtful. Enrique watched him, trying to decipher what was going on in his son's mind. There was a change in his behavior, a lightness that contrasted with the rigid atmosphere of the mansion. In his room, Raphael took out a notebook and began to jot down phrases he had heard from the beggar. Words about hope, choices and regrets. He felt there was a wisdom in that man that his father had never shared. Enrique, suspicious, began to follow his son's steps in disguise. He wanted to anticipate any move, to control the situation before it slipped from his grasp. The millionaire, however, didn't realize that this control was already fading away. That night, lying in his luxurious bed, Enrique had trouble sleeping. The image of his son beside the beggar returned to his mind repeatedly. With each recollection, the discomfort grew stronger. He didn't know it yet, but this convergence of two such different worlds would be the spark that illuminated the darkest secrets of his own life. Enrique could no longer bear the silence. On a Sunday morning, he summoned Raphael to the mansion's office. The austere environment, filled with imposing furniture, seemed to heighten the tension. The millionaire didn't beat around the bush. He got straight to the point, asking about the friendship with the beggar. Raphael, surprised, tried to defend himself. He said the man was different, that he had incredible stories to tell, that there was wisdom in his words. But the more he justified it, the more irritated Enrique became. He couldn't accept that a stranger had so much influence over his son. "You don't understand, Dad. He really listens to me," Raphael confessed, his voice thick with emotion. Enrique felt a blow to his pride. How could he, his own father, not be enough to listen to his son? That sentence echoed in his mind like a silent accusation. The argument intensified. Enrique demanded that Raphael cut off contact immediately. The young man, however, raised his eyes and replied firmly, "I can't do that. He's my friend." It was the first time the heir had defied his father so directly. Enrique was in shock. He was accustomed to obedience and unquestionable respect within his home. His son's tone, however, revealed a new stance, an independent spirit he was not prepared to face. The silence that followed was heavy. The millionaire took a deep breath, trying to control himself, but resentment was already etched on his face. He decided to end the conversation without another word, only with a cold, distant look. Raphael left the office feeling misunderstood. Deep down, he wished his father could see the value beyond appearances, but he knew that would be nearly impossible. The millionaire's heart seemed shielded against any idea outside of his own standards. Enrique remained alone, staring out the window. The memory of the beggar sitting next to his son seemed more threatening than ever. There was something there that he needed to uncover, something that could not be ignored. The millionaire no longer saw the man as a simple vagrant. Now he was a shadow haunting his family, someone who had the power to shake the authority it had taken a lifetime to build. And in that moment, Henrique swore to himself that he would find answers, no matter the cost. The following week, Henrique decided to observe up close. He had his driver parked discreetly near the square while he watched, hidden behind the tinted window. There they were again, Raphael and the beggar, talking like old acquaintances. This time, Henrique focused on the words. Straining to hear, he managed to catch fragments of the conversation. To his surprise, the beggar spoke of places, situations, and people that belonged to his own family's past. It was impossible for a stranger to know about such things. With each sentence, the millionaire's heart beat faster. The beggar mentioned an old company Henrique had inherited from his father, something few remembered. He also spoke of a trip Henrique had taken as a young man, filled with intimate details. Henrique felt a chill run down his spine. There was no doubt. That man knew too much. And that could only mean one of two things. Either someone had told him family secrets, or the beggar was far more connected to them than he was letting on. Seeing Raphael laugh at something the beggar said, Henrique felt a mixture of fear and anger. He couldn't understand how that man, hidden under rags, could hold so much power. It was as if a ghost from the past had returned to haunt him. That evening at dinner, Henrique tried to probe his son with subtle questions. He asked what they talked about, who that man was, where he came from. Raphael, however, answered with simplicity, saying only that the beggar spoke of life, choices, and regrets. The vague answers only heightened his suspicion. Henrique realized that his son wasn't hiding anything on purpose, but there was much more to that friendship than the boy could comprehend. After dinner, Henrique locked himself in his office and began to review old documents, memories of his youth, searching for some connection. The more he thought, the more his past seemed to threaten to resurface. With every clue, every detail, the millionaire was certain he was about to face something bigger than he could control. The truth, no matter how deeply buried, was beginning to show signs that it would come to light. And deep down, Henrique knew, when that moment came, nothing in his life would ever be the same. Henrique could no longer stand living in uncertainty. He hired a private investigator to follow the beggar's steps and gather any information about his life. He imagined that with a few days of work, he would have a detailed report. But the result was unexpected. There was nothing in the official records. The report contained only confusing fragments, brief temporary jobs, shelters where the man had appeared and then vanished, dates that didn't add up. It was as if the beggar had emerged from nowhere, with no defined past. This left Henrique even more disturbed. With growing anger, the millionaire began to see the man not just as a threat, but as an enigma that needed to be solved at any cost. He felt powerless in the face of the lack of information, something that went against everything he was used to. In the square, Raphael continued his meetings, and each time he returned home more reflective. His son seemed to be absorbing lessons about humility, choices, and regrets, topics Henrique never addressed. This increased his insecurity as a father. One afternoon, Henrique discreetly approached the conversation and heard the beggar mention a name that chilled his blood, his own father's. It was impossible to ignore. How could that man know such intimate details about his family? Disturbed, the millionaire began to have nightmares. He saw confusing images from the past, unresolved memories that resurfaced without warning. It was as if the beggar's presence were opening old, unhealed wounds. Fear turned into anger. Henrique no longer just wanted answers. He wanted to control the narrative, to prevent secrets from coming to light. He knew that if this connection were revealed, his image and his family could crumble. Meanwhile, Raphael grew increasingly distant at home. The boy didn't understand his father's hostility toward the beggar. To him, he was just a wise man sharing valuable stories. Enrique, however, saw a danger in every word spoken by that man. The silence hidden in the beggar's eyes seemed to scream secrets that were yet to explode. And deep down, the millionaire sensed, the more he tried to bury the past, the stronger it would come back to haunt him. The next morning, Enrique called Rafael for another talk. He tried to use a calmer, yet still authoritarian tone. He asked his son to stay away from the beggar for good, claiming it was dangerous to trust strangers from the streets. Rafael, however, showed unexpected firmness. He said he saw no danger at all, and that for the first time he felt he was learning something truly important about life. His voice didn't tremble. There was conviction in every word. Enrique felt his anger rise. He was used to controlling all decisions within the family, and seeing his son rebel was almost unbearable. He felt he was losing his authority, the pillar that supported his pride. The tension between father and son intensified with each encounter. Rafael came home later, his eyes holding a mixture of peace and defiance. Enrique realized that the beggar was not only gaining the boy's trust, but also pushing him further and further away. During one dinner, the argument exploded. Enrique raised his voice, demanding respect. Rafael, in turn, responded with tears in his eyes. "You never listened to me, Dad." But he does. The sentence hung in the silence of the table, leaving everyone stunned. Enrique's wife tried to intervene, pleading for calm, but he was blinded by fury. He felt betrayed not only by his son, but by life itself, which seemed to be slipping from his control. The beggar was now more than an enemy. He was an invisible rival within his own home. Rafael left the table and went up to his room, slamming the door hard. The sound echoed through the mansion's corridors, symbolizing the rift between father and son. Enrique remained seated, motionless, his gaze lost. In his room, Rafael picked up the notebook where he wrote down the beggar's phrases and wrote, "The truth always finds a way." He felt he was closer to discovering something that would change everything. Enrique, alone in the dining room, clenched his fists. He swore to himself that he would do whatever it took to remove that man from his life, even if he had to resort to more drastic measures. And so, the conflict between father and son was no longer just about friendship. It was about secrets, buried truths, and a past on the verge of coming to light. Enrique could no longer stand to see his authority being eroded. That night, he left the mansion in secret and went to the square where the beggar usually stayed. He carried a thick envelope, stuffed with money, believing it would solve the situation. As he approached, the millionaire wasted no time on words. He held out the envelope and said coldly, "Take this and disappear. I want you away from my son." His tone was one of command, as if he were handling another business deal. The beggar looked at the envelope, then raised his eyes to meet Enrique's. A heavy silence fell between them. Then calmly he replied, "The truth can't be bought." His voice was firm, filled with conviction. Enrique felt his blood boil. He was not used to hearing no, especially not from someone who lived in rags. "You don't understand who you're dealing with," he threatened, trying to intimidate him, but the beggar was not shaken. Instead, he smiled sadly and said, "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, better than you can imagine." The words hit Enrique like daggers, leaving him bewildered. What did that man mean by that? Refusing to accept the rejection, Enrique threw the envelope on the ground and stormed off, his steps firm. The beggar didn't move, leaving the money there untouched, as proof that his dignity was beyond any price. Back in the car, Enrique was breathing heavily. He had never felt such contempt from someone in such an inferior position. The beggar's gaze, however, seemed to carry a weight of authority greater than his entire empire. That night, Enrique barely slept. The phrase repeated in his mind, "I know exactly who I'm dealing with." Each repetition sounded like a veiled threat, a reminder that the past was about to surface. Deep down, he knew he could no longer put it off. The beggar wouldn't disappear with money or intimidation. He would have to find out who he really was, and fast. Enrique didn't imagine it yet, but he was getting closer and closer to facing a truth that had been chasing him for years. The next day, Enrique decided to take matters into his own hands. He returned to the square, but this time he stayed hidden, watching from a distance. He saw the beggar take a small object wrapped in cloth from his pocket. Raphael, curious, asked to see it. It was an old locket, worn by time. Enrique recognized it immediately. It was identical to the one that had belonged to his mother, who had passed away decades ago. The shock left him breathless. How could that man have something so personal to his family? Raphael looked at the locket with fascination, asking about its origin. The beggar, however, averted his gaze and said only, "A gift from the past." His words were enigmatic but laden with pain. Enrique felt dizzy. The locket wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a family heirloom, passed down from generation to generation, and it should have been safely stored in his house. The fact that it was in the beggar's hands was proof of a direct link between them. The millionaire's head spun with 1,000 thoughts. Possibilities jumbled together, but none seemed plausible without opening old wounds. The more he reflected, the clearer it became that this man was no stranger. At dinner that night, Enrique watched Raphael in silence. His son was radiant, commenting that the beggar seemed to carry stories worth more than any fortune. Every word was like salt in his wound. Enrique tried to play it cool, but his wife noticed his nervousness. When she casually mentioned that she seemed to recognize the locket her son described, he froze inside. Fear was written all over his face, even as he tried to hide it. Later, alone in his office, Enrique opened an old safe and confirmed his suspicions. The locket that should have been there was gone. How had the beggar gotten it? Who could have allowed this to happen? The millionaire closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. Now, there was no more doubt. That man was part of his history, part of a past he had always tried to bury. And for the first time, Enrique felt that he was not in control of his own destiny. Enrique began to realize he wasn't the only one unsettled by the beggar's presence. His wife, Helena, showed clear signs of nervousness whenever the topic came up. Her gaze would shift, her hands would tremble discreetly, and her tone of voice would lose its firmness. During dinner, Raphael spoke excitedly about the conversations he had with the man from the square. Helena nearly dropped her glass. "I don't think you should get so close to those people," she said quickly, trying to end the conversation. Enrique watched in silence, but his mind was racing. That reaction wasn't normal. It seemed more like fear than simple concern. What if Helena also knew something about the beggar's past? That night, when they were alone, Enrique questioned his wife directly. He asked if she knew that man, if there was something he should know. Helena denied it, but her eyes betrayed her words. Something was being hidden, and he could feel it. Enrique didn't press the issue at that moment, but he became even more determined. He realized the mystery wasn't just in the square. It had already invaded his own home. The feeling that everyone was hiding something from him was suffocating. In her room, Helena cried silently. She held an old portrait in her hands, a memory of a time she wished she could forget. She knew that sooner or later the truth would come out, and she feared the consequences. Meanwhile, Raphael continued to grow closer to the beggar. The bond between them grew, and Enrique felt increasingly isolated, as if he were being replaced in his own son's heart. With each passing day, the emotional distance within the mansion became more apparent. It was as if the beggar's invisible presence were eroding what little harmony was left. Enrique, alone in his office, stared at the locket he had seen in the wrong hands. He knew now. He could no longer run. He had to confront what was hidden in the past head-on. And deep down, he felt that his wife was at the center of this secret. Determined to solve the mystery once and for all, Enrique returned to the square on a rainy afternoon. This time he didn't just want to observe. He approached the beggar and demanded answers. "Who are you? Where did you get that locket?" The man looked up, his eyes wet with rain, and smiled bitterly. "Do you really not remember, Enrique?" The question struck the millionaire like lightning. Something in that voice, in that gaze, awakened forgotten memories. The beggar then revealed what would change everything. Years ago, he had worked for Enrique's family. He had been betrayed by a cruel decision made by the millionaire's father, a decision that left him with nothing, condemned to live on the streets. Enrique felt the ground disappear from beneath his feet. The locket, the beggar explained, had been given to him as a symbol of trust by Enrique's mother before everything fell apart. The jewel was a reminder of days when there was still hope. Shocked, Enrique asked why the man had waited so long to reappear. The beggar answered serenely, "I didn't come for revenge. I just don't want the truth to be buried with me." As the rain fell, Raphael came running, curious about the argument. The beggar looked at him with tenderness and said, "Your grandfather chose the path of wealth. I paid the price, but you can still choose differently." Raphael stood in silence, trying to process the words. He looked at his father for confirmation, but Enrique remained motionless, unable to deny or accept. The weight of the revelation was crushing him. Helena, upon hearing of the encounter, broke down in tears. She confirmed that she knew the story and had feared the moment it would come to light. "I wanted to protect you, Enrique," she said between sobs. That night, the millionaire faced his reflection in the mirror. For the first time, he didn't see himself as the ruthless businessman, but as someone carrying inherited guilt, unable to escape his own choices. And so, the secret that was never supposed to be revealed finally came to light, leaving everyone on the brink of an irreversible rupture. Raphael remained silent for long minutes after hearing the beggar's revelation. His eyes darted between the ragged man and his father, searching for a denial that never came. Enrique's silence spoke louder than any explanation. "So it's true?" the young man asked, his voice cracking. "All of your wealth was built on his misery?" Enrique tried to justify himself, saying that the decisions had been his father's, not his. But Raphael was not convinced. "Even so, you knew," his son retorted. The pain in his words pierced Enrique's heart like invisible daggers. For the first time, Raphael looked at him not as a hero or an example, but as an accomplice to a cruel past. Anger and disappointment made Raphael turn away quickly. He left the square without looking back, ignoring his father's calls. Enrique tried to follow, but his steps were heavy, as if he were carrying the full weight of the revealed truth. At home, Raphael locked himself in his room. The memories of his encounters with the beggar now made sense. Every phrase about regret, every pained look, was a reflection of a real injustice. And his father was at the center of that story. Helena tried to comfort her son, but he refused. "You both knew, and you hid it from me," he shouted, accusing them both of being liars. For Raphael, the family's silence was as painful as the injustice committed. Meanwhile, Enrique wandered alone through the living room, feeling more defeated than ever. His empty gaze reflected the collapse of his authority and the estrangement of his son. It was as if everything he had built was crumbling before his eyes. That night was the longest of Enrique's life. The silence of the mansion weighed on him like a sentence. Each tick of the clock echoed as a cruel reminder that the past had finally come to collect its due. Raphael, on the other side of the house, cried silently. For the first time, he didn't know if he could ever again trust the father he had always idealized. The chasm between them seemed insurmountable. And deep down, Enrique knew. It wasn't just his son's trust he was losing. It was also the right to see himself as a man of integrity. The following days were a whirlwind. The revelation about the beggar began to circulate in quiet conversations until it reached the local press. Sensationalist articles emerged questioning the origin of Henrique's family fortune. In newspapers and on television, headlines accused millionaire heir to an empire stained by injustice. The reputation he had cultivated over decades was being destroyed in a matter of hours. In business, investors began to pull back. Meetings were cancelled, contracts suspended. Henrique's empire, which had always seemed unshakable, now trembled under the weight of the exposed truth. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere was one of complete collapse. Helena avoided looking at her husband, consumed by the guilt of having kept silent for so long. Raphael barely spoke to his parents, immersed in a mixture of anger and sadness. Henrique tried to control the damage, hiring lawyers and image consultants, but no strategy could erase the fact that his history was tainted. The truth, once revealed, could not be buried again. The millionaire found himself alone in meetings, abandoned by former allies. People who once revered him now avoided him. It was as if he had become a pariah in the very world he had helped build. At night, he would walk through the empty corridors of the mansion, feeling like a prisoner within his own walls. The silence now was not just from his family, but from the world that rejected him. Every luxurious detail seemed to mock his pain. The beggar, on the other hand, continued his simple routine, observing from a distance. He didn't seek revenge, but he knew the truth was already doing its work. Henrique, in desperation, realized he had reached his limit. His fortune, his name, his authority, everything was at risk. The only thing he could still save was his son's trust, and deep down, he knew that winning back Raphael would be the most difficult battle of his life. Henrique could no longer stand living amidst half-truths. He decided to confront the beggar once and for all. He asked Raphael to go with him, believing his son's presence would be crucial to facing the truth without any masks. The square, the stage for so many encounters, now felt like an open-air courtroom. The beggar was there, sitting as always, with the serene gaze of someone who carried a lifetime on his shoulders. Henrique approached with firm steps, but his heart was racing. "It's time to end this," the millionaire said, facing the man. The beggar looked up and replied calmly, "I never started anything, Henrique. You were the one who chose to hide." Raphael watched in silence, his fists clenched. His gaze demanded answers. Henrique felt the pressure crushing him, but he knew he could no longer run. He took a deep breath and began to speak about the past he had tried so hard to bury. He revealed the story of how his father had made cruel decisions, leaving the man on the margins of life. He admitted that he had known about the injustice but had chosen to remain silent, protecting the legacy instead of the truth. Every word was a painful confession. Raphael cried, but he didn't move away. The beggar, for his part, just listened, as if he already knew every detail. His expression was not one of hatred, but of sadness. "You could have changed this, but you chose silence," Raphael said, his voice choked with emotion. Henrique felt the weight of the accusation, knowing there was no excuse that could erase years of omission. The millionaire then fell to his knees, a gesture he would have never made in public. "I was wrong, but I don't want to keep being wrong. Raphael, I can't change the past, but I can choose to be different now." The beggar stared at him for a long time, and after a heavy silence said, "Redemption doesn't come with words, it comes with choices." And in that instant, Henrique realized that the greatest judgment came not from society, but from his own family. After the confrontation, Henrique returned home resolute. He knew he couldn't win back his son's trust with promises alone. He needed to prove, with actions, that he was willing to change. The next morning he called a press conference. The room was filled with cameras and eager reporters. Instead of denying the accusations, as everyone expected, Henrique did the unthinkable. He publicly confessed the whole truth. "My fortune was born from the wrong choices of the past. I remained silent in the face of injustice, and for that, I am also guilty. Today, I have decided to give up a part of this empire to repair what was done." His words echoed across the country, shocking everyone. The silence after the statement was deafening until the camera flashes illuminated the millionaire's tired face. For the first time, he spoke not as a businessman, but as a man, fragile, repentant, and human. The decision came at a high cost. Investors abandoned him for good, deals were lost, and his image as a tycoon crumbled. But Enrique felt that somehow the weight on his shoulders was beginning to lift. Rafael, watching the speech on television, felt his heart ache. For the first time, he saw a sincere gesture from his father, something beyond pride and wealth. It still hurt, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Helena cried silently. She knew how much this was costing her husband, but she also recognized that it was perhaps the only way to save their family. In the square, the beggar watched the broadcast on a small, borrowed device. When he heard Henrique's words, he closed his eyes and smiled slightly. It was a sign that at last justice was beginning to be served. Back at the mansion, Henrique faced the emptiness around him. He didn't know what would be left of his empire, but he was sure of one thing. He was willing to lose everything if it meant winning back his son's love and trust. And in that act of sacrifice, the millionaire realized that perhaps he was finally learning the true value of life.